The rope cut into Alira's wrists as two guards dragged her across the frozen courtyard, her bare feet scraping against stone that had not seen the sun in weeks. The crowd that had gathered was not silent. They shouted, they spat, they threw handfuls of dirt and rotten vegetables at her face. A woman near the front screamed that Alira had cursed her cow, and a man beside her yelled that she had poisoned the well behind the mill. None of it was true, but truth had stopped mattering the moment fear took hold of the village. Alira did not cry. She had cried enough the night before, when the soldiers first came to her small home and pulled her from her bed without explanation. Now she simply walked, her chin lifted, her eyes searching the crowd for one familiar face that might still believe in her. She found none. Even her neighbors, people she had shared bread with only weeks earlier, looked away or joined the shouting, afraid that any hint of sympathy might mark them as guilty by association. At the center of the courtyard stood a raised wooden platform, and upon it sat the members of the village council, wrapped in fur-lined robes despite the mild morning air. Beside them stood Lord Gareth Colton, the nobleman whose accusations had set this entire storm into motion. His fields had failed that season, his cattle had grown sick and died, and rather than accept the plain misfortune of bad soil and a harsh winter, he had pointed a trembling finger at the quiet girl who lived at the edge of the forest and gathered herbs for a living. She speaks to creatures no honest woman should speak to, Gareth had told the council only days before. I have seen her with my own eyes, sitting among foxes and crows as though they were her kin. My land has died because her shadow passed over it. It was a ridiculous claim, built on nothing but jealousy and desperation, yet fear does not require evidence. It only requires an audience willing to believe. The council leader, an aging man named Edmund Voss, rose from his seat and raised a hand for silence. The crowd quieted just enough for his voice to carry. Alira of Aldenmore, he announced, his tone flat and rehearsed. You stand accused of dark practices against this village. The council has considered the evidence brought before it and has reached its judgment. Alira's heart pounded so hard she feared it might crack her ribs. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself one final time, but a guard's hand clamped over her shoulder and forced her to remain silent. There is an old law, Edmund continued, older than any of us, older than this village itself. When guilt cannot be proven by ordinary means, the accused shall be given to the wolf den beneath the old keep. If the wolves show mercy, it shall be taken as a sign of innocence. If they do not, then justice will have been served by nature itself, and no man's hands will carry the blood. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in solemn agreement, believing this to be a fair and ancient tradition. Others exchanged uneasy glances, understanding perfectly well what the wolf den actually meant. No one had ever survived it. Not once in living memory. It was not a trial. It was an execution, dressed in the language of fairness, so that no single person would have to bear the weight of what was about to happen. She had heard whispered stories of the wolf den as a child, tales meant to frighten misbehaving children into obedience, tales that ended with the pit growing quiet and the guards walking away without looking back. She had never imagined those stories would one day be about her. Please, she finally managed to say, her voice cracking. I have done nothing. I only gather herbs. I only try to help the sick when the healer cannot reach them in time. Ask anyone in the lower village. Ask the children I have treated for fever. I am no witch. Her words fell on a crowd too frightened to listen, and a council too eager to close the matter. Edmund did not even look at her as he gave the order. Take her to the keep. The guards pulled her forward, and the crowd parted to let them pass, some looking away in shame, most simply watching with the same detached curiosity one might give to a passing storm. Alira caught sight of a young boy near the edge of the square, no older than 7, tears streaming down his face as he clutched his mother's skirt. She recognized him. She had treated his fever only a month before, staying by his bedside through the night until it broke. His mother pulled him away before their eyes could meet again. The path to the old keep wound through the narrow streets of the upper village, past the bakery whose owner had once given her free bread on cold mornings, past the chapel, where she had prayed every week without ever missing a single service, past the well, where children used to laugh and play before their parents taught them to fear her. Every step felt like walking through a life that no longer belonged to her. The keep itself was ancient, built long before anyone could remember by whom or for what true purpose. Its stones were dark and worn, its towers crumbling in places where ivy had claimed victory over mortar. Beneath its foundations lay the wolf den, a deep circular pit dug generations ago, its walls smooth and impossible to climb, its floor hidden from view by shadow and distance. Elira was led through a narrow archway and down a spiraling staircase that seemed to descend far longer than the keep's outer walls should have allowed. Torches lined the walls, their flames flickering weakly against the damp stone, casting long shadows that danced like specters ahead of her. The air grew colder with every step, and a smell reached her nose that she would never forget, wild and earthy, the scent of creatures that lived beyond the reach of human comfort. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy iron door stood closed, guarded by two soldiers who barely glanced at her as she approached. One of them, an older man with tired eyes, looked at her for just a moment longer than necessary. There was no cruelty in his gaze, only a quiet, resigned sadness, as though he too understood the injustice of what was about to happen, but lacked any power to stop it. "Is there truly no other way?" Elira whispered, more to herself than to anyone listening. The older guard said nothing, but he did not look away either. Beyond the iron door lay a small stone chamber that overlooked the pit itself through a wide gap in the wall, protected by iron bars thick enough to withstand centuries of desperate hands. Elira was brought to this chamber to wait, her wrists finally freed from the rope now that escape meant nothing at all. Where would she run? The keep had only one way out, and even if she managed to slip past the guards, the village beyond would offer no shelter to a girl condemned by its own council. She sat on the cold floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and finally allowed herself to look through the bars into the pit below. It was vast, far larger than she had imagined, its floor scattered with old bones bleached pale by time, its walls rising high enough that no creature, human or otherwise, could ever hope to climb out. Somewhere in the shadows below, she heard the soft sound of movement, a low breath, the faint click of claws against stone. She could not see them yet, but she knew they were there, watching, waiting, as patient as the mountain itself. Night fell slowly over the keep, and with it came a silence that felt heavier than any noise. Elira remained in the small stone chamber, her back pressed against the wall, listening to the distant sounds drifting up from the pit below. She told herself that fear would not help her now. If these were to be her final hours, she would not spend them shaking and weeping. She would spend them remembering every kindness she had ever given, every life she had ever helped, every moment of her short existence that had meant something good. She thought of her mother, who had taught her the names of every healing plant in the forest before sickness took her away too soon. She thought of the old healer who lived at the edge of the village, a woman named Agnes who had become something like family to her after her mother's passing, teaching her patience and skill, and the quiet dignity of helping others without expecting anything in return. As if summoned by the very thought of her, a soft knock echoed against the chamber door, followed by hushed words exchanged between the guard outside and someone requesting entry. The door creaked open, and there, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak, stood Agnes herself, her weathered face lined with worry, her eyes glistening in the dim torchlight. "I do not have long," Agnes whispered, kneeling beside Elira and taking her hands into her own. "The guard outside owes me a debt from years past. He will give me only a few moments." "You should not have come," Elira said, though her voice trembled with gratitude rather than anger. "If they see you here, they may accuse you too." "Let them," Agnes replied fiercely. "I have lived a long life, and I will not spend what remains of it hiding from cowards." She reached into the folds of her cloak and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth, pressing it firmly into Elira's palm. Unwrapping it carefully, Elira found a smooth carved piece of bone, etched with markings she did not recognize, worn smooth by age and handling. "What is this?" Elira asked. "A memory," Agnes said simply. "Many years ago, before you were even born, I found an injured wolf pup near these very woods, abandoned and starving after hunters killed the rest of its pack. I nursed it back to health, though I never expected to see it again once it returned to the wild. This bone belonged to its mother, and I have kept it all these years, as a reminder of that small mercy." Elira turned the bone over in her hands, feeling its strange weight. "Why give it to me now?" Agnes met her eyes with a quiet intensity. "The wolves remember kindness longer than men remember cruelty. I do not know what waits for you in that pit tomorrow, child, but I know this. Nothing in this world forgets an act of true compassion, not even the creatures we fear the most." Keep this close. Whatever happens, let it remind you that you are not walking into that darkness without a single thread of hope." Before Alira could ask another question, footsteps echoed from the staircase above, and Agnes rose quickly, pulling her hood back over her head. "I must go before they find me here. Be brave, Alira. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that not everyone in this village has lost their heart." With that, she disappeared back through the iron door, leaving Alira alone once more, with only the bone token clutched tightly in her palm, and the distant sounds of the pit rising softly through the darkness. Sleep did not come easily that night. Alira drifted in and out of restless dreams, images of her mother's face blending with the shadowed shapes moving below the chamber floor. At times she woke with a start, certain she had heard footsteps approaching, only to find the corridor empty and silent. At other times she simply stared at the bone token in her hand, tracing the strange markings with her fingertip, wondering if Agnes's words held any truth, or if they were simply the comfort of an old woman, unwilling to say goodbye, without offering some small piece of hope. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the narrow window slit above her, Alira heard the heavy sound of boots descending the staircase, followed by the low murmur of voices discussing the day's arrangements, as though she were nothing more than an item to be delivered. The iron door swung open, and 2 guards entered, their faces carefully blank, trained not to feel anything for the task ahead of them. "It is time," one of them said quietly. Alira rose slowly, tucking the bone token deep into the folds of her sleeve, where no one would think to search. Whatever waited for her in that pit, she would not face it without Agnes's gift, and she would not face it without the memory of every kindness she had ever given or received. If these truly were her final moments, she intended to walk into them with her head held high, refusing to let fear be the last thing she ever felt. The guards led her back up the spiraling staircase and out into the courtyard above, where the morning crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by rumor and curiosity, to witness what the ancient law would decide. Alira scanned the faces once more, searching for any flicker of doubt, any sign that the village might yet reconsider its judgment. She found only the same detached curiosity as before, though here and there she noticed a few eyes that refused to meet her own, perhaps burdened by a guilt they were unwilling to voice aloud. Lord Gareth Colton stood near the council platform, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. If he felt any satisfaction at the sight of her being led toward her fate, he hid it well behind a mask of solemn duty. Alira wondered, not for the first time, what truly lay behind his accusations. What fear or greed had driven a man to point a finger at an innocent girl, rather than accept the simple misfortunes of nature? The guards brought her to the edge of the pit itself, where a heavy wooden platform extended out over the darkness below, fitted with a simple rope and harness system, used to lower condemned prisoners into the den. Alira's legs trembled as she approached the edge, though she forced herself to keep her breathing steady, to remember Agnes's words, to hold on to whatever small comfort the bone token might offer. Edmund Voss stepped forward once more, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Let it be known that this trial follows the old law faithfully. If the creatures below show mercy, Alira of Aldenmore shall be declared innocent before this entire village. If they do not, then nature itself shall have rendered its judgment, and no further blame shall fall upon this council." The harness was fastened around Alira's waist, the rope pulled taut by 2 soldiers positioned at a wooden winch nearby. She closed her eyes for just a moment, pressing her palm against the bone token hidden in her sleeve, and whispered a silent prayer to whatever forces might be listening. "Lower her," Edmund commanded. The rope began to creak, and slowly, inch by inch, Alira felt the platform beneath her shift as she was guided over the edge of the pit and down into the waiting darkness below, the crowd's murmurs fading into a distant hum as the cold, earthy air of the den rose up to greet her. The descent felt endless, though in truth it lasted only a few minutes. Alira kept her eyes fixed upward for as long as she could, watching the circle of pale morning sky grow smaller and smaller above her, the faces of the crowd shrinking into indistinct shapes lining the rim of the pit. She could hear whispers drifting down, some filled with morbid anticipation, others hushed with what might have been genuine sorrow. As the rope continued to lower her, the darkness around her deepened, and the smell she had noticed the night before grew stronger, wild and earthy, and undeniably alive. Somewhere below, she heard movement, careful and measured, circling patiently, as though waiting for her arrival, with a patience that unsettled her more than any growl or snarl could have. Her feet finally touched solid ground, and the harness loosened around her waist as the rope was released from above. She stood perfectly still in the center of the pit, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light filtering down from the opening far above her, and for the first time, she saw them clearly. There were perhaps a dozen wolves scattered throughout the den, their fur ranging from pale silver to deep charcoal gray, their eyes reflecting what little light reached the pit floor like scattered embers in the darkness. They did not rush toward her. They did not snarl or bare their teeth. Instead, they watched her with a quiet, unsettling intelligence, as though sizing up not her vulnerability, but her intentions. Elira's breath caught in her throat as the largest of them, a massive gray wolf with a scarred muzzle and eyes the color of pale amber, stepped forward from the shadows, moving with slow, deliberate steps that carried none of the aggression she had expected. The crowd above fell utterly silent, leaning forward against the pit's edge to watch what would happen next, and even Edmund Voss, standing rigid beside Lord Gareth, found himself holding his breath. The wolf stopped only a few feet from Elira, close enough that she could see every detail of its weathered face, close enough to smell the wild scent of its fur mixing with the cold morning air. It lifted its head slightly, nostrils flaring, and took a long, careful breath, as though reading something in the air around her that no human eye could ever perceive. Elira remained perfectly still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the wolf could hear it, the bone token clutched tightly against her palm inside her sleeve. She did not know if moving would provoke an attack or if remaining still would be seen as an invitation. She simply trusted, in that single suspended moment, that whatever mercy Agnes had spoken of the night before might yet prove true. The great wolf took one final step forward and lowered its head toward her outstretched hand, sniffing gently at the fabric of her sleeve, where the bone token lay hidden. A low sound rumbled from its chest, not a growl, but something softer, almost curious, almost recognizing. Above them, the crowd watched in stunned silence, as the wolf that had killed every prisoner ever lowered into that pit, simply sat down beside the girl it had been meant to destroy, its amber eyes fixed on her with something that could only be described as quiet, ancient understanding. Not a single person in that courtyard spoke a word. Not the council, not the guards, not even Lord Gareth himself, who stood frozen at the edge of the pit with an expression no one had ever seen on his face before, somewhere between disbelief and dawning fear. For the first time since her arrest, Elira allowed herself the smallest breath of hope, though she knew, deep down, that surviving the pit was only the beginning of a much larger storm still waiting to unfold above. The great wolf remained beside her for what felt like an eternity, its warm breath visible in the cold morning air, its amber eyes never leaving her face. Slowly, carefully, Elira lowered herself to sit on the packed earth of the den floor, moving with the same deliberate calm she had used years earlier when approaching frightened animals brought to her for healing. She had learned long ago that fear given to a frightened creature only doubled the fear it already carried, and something in her heart told her these wolves were not so different from the injured foxes and wounded birds she had nursed back to health throughout her short life. One by one, the other wolves began to approach, though none came as close as the great gray one who now rested his head near her knee. A smaller female with a silver coat circled at a distance, before finally lying down a few feet away, watching Elira with curious, cautious eyes. Two younger wolves, likely pups from a season or two before, peered out from behind a large boulder near the far wall of the pit, their ears twitching with uncertain interest rather than aggression. Above the pit, the crowd remained frozen in disbelief. Whispers finally broke the heavy silence, spreading from person to person like ripples across still water. Some claimed this was undeniable proof of dark magic, that only a witch could tame such creatures with mere presence alone. Others argued the opposite, insisting that no evil soul could ever earn such trust from beasts known for their fierce and unforgiving nature. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, none of them quite prepared for an outcome the old law had never truly anticipated. Edmund Voss cleared his throat, attempting to regain control over a situation rapidly slipping beyond his understanding. "The trial is not yet concluded," he announced, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "We shall observe further before rendering any final judgment." Lord Gareth Colton said nothing, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene below with growing unease. This was not the outcome he had expected, nor the outcome he desperately needed. If the wolves showed mercy, questions would inevitably follow. Questions about the true cause of his ruined harvest. Questions he had hoped would die quietly, alongside the girl he had so eagerly condemned. Hours passed. Though time seemed to move strangely within the confines of the pit, Alira remained seated among the wolves, occasionally reaching out a tentative hand to let the great gray one sniff her fingers, careful never to move too quickly, never to show the fear that still trembled somewhere beneath her calm exterior. As the sun rose higher and the morning chill began to fade, she found herself growing almost comfortable in their strange company, a feeling she never could have imagined possible only a day before. Food was eventually lowered down on a small wooden platform, a gesture more out of confusion than kindness. As the guards above debated what to do with a prisoner the wolves refused to harm, Alira shared a portion of bread with the two younger pups, who approached cautiously at first before growing bold enough to accept the offering directly from her open palm. The silver-coated female watched this exchange with quiet interest, her earlier wariness slowly softening into something that almost resembled acceptance. By the time evening shadows began creeping across the pit floor, word of the strange trial had spread far beyond the village walls, carried by travelers and merchants who had witnessed the spectacle firsthand. Stories multiplied and twisted with each retelling, some claiming the girl commanded the wolves through forbidden spells, others insisting she had transformed into one of the creatures herself the moment she touched the ground. The truth, as it often does, became harder to find beneath so many competing tales. It did not take long for these rumors to reach the ears of King Edwin Marsh, who ruled from the grand capital, several days' journey from the small village of Aldenmore. The king had grown accustomed to hearing exaggerated tales from distant corners of his kingdom, most of which he dismissed as the idle chatter of bored villagers, with too much time and too little sense. Yet something about this particular story caught his attention in a way the others had not. King Edwin was neither a cruel man nor an especially superstitious one, though the demands of ruling a kingdom often required him to walk a careful line between tradition and reason. He had inherited the throne from his father only 3 years prior, and in that short time he had already grown weary of councils and nobles who used old laws and ancient fears to settle personal grudges disguised as justice. Something about a girl surviving the wolf den, a fate no prisoner had ever escaped, struck him as either an extraordinary miracle or an extraordinary lie, and he intended to discover which. "Send word to Aldenmore," he instructed his advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Lady Corinne Ashby, who had served his father before him. "I wish to see this girl for myself before any further judgment is passed against her." Lady Corinne raised an eyebrow but did not question the order, understanding well enough that her king's curiosity, once ignited, rarely extinguished without satisfaction. Within the hour, riders were dispatched toward the distant village, carrying instructions that Alira of Aldenmore was to be kept alive and unharmed until the king himself could determine her fate. Meanwhile, within the pit, Alira had settled into an uneasy rhythm alongside her unlikely companions. She slept that first night curled against the packed earth, using her cloak as a thin barrier against the cold, while the great gray wolf remained close beside her, his presence somehow more comforting than threatening. She found herself wondering about Agnes's words once more, about mercy remembered across years and generations, about the strange and quiet bond now forming between herself and creatures the entire village had feared for, as long as anyone could remember. The following morning brought fresh commotion above the pit. Villagers gathered once more, drawn by curiosity and disbelief, watching as guards lowered a rope ladder rather than the usual harness, a clear sign that something had changed in how the council intended to handle this unprecedented situation. Alira watched the ladder descend with cautious hope, wondering if this signaled her release or merely a change in how her captivity would be managed. A single guard descended partway down the ladder, keeping a respectful distance from the wolves who watched him with sharp, assessing eyes. "The king has ordered your survival be confirmed and reported," he called down to her, his voice echoing slightly against the pit stone walls. "You are to remain here until further instruction arrives." "For how long?" Alira asked, though she suspected the guard held no answer beyond what he had already given. He offered only a helpless shrug before climbing back up the ladder, leaving her once more alone with her silent, watchful companions. Days passed in this strange limbo, each one blending into the next with a rhythm that felt almost peaceful despite the circumstances. Food arrived twice daily, lowered carefully by guards who no longer bothered hiding their fascination with the girl who lived unharmed among wolves meant to devour her. Elira used this time to study her companions more closely, noticing the small details that revealed their individual personalities beneath the fearsome reputation attached to their kind. The great gray leader, whom she began quietly calling Ash for the pale coloring around his muzzle, proved surprisingly gentle despite his intimidating size, often nudging the younger pups away from danger with a careful, protective nose. The silver-coated female, whom she named Wren for her light, quick movements, grew bolder with each passing day, eventually resting close enough that Elira could feel the rise and fall of her breathing through the night. On the 5th day of her strange captivity, a new commotion stirred above the pit, different from the curious murmurs of villagers or the routine footsteps of guards delivering food. Elira rose to her feet as the sound of many boots echoed against the stone staircase leading down toward the keep's lower chambers, accompanied by voices speaking with an authority she had not heard since her original sentencing. The rope ladder descended once more, and this time, a figure she did not recognize began climbing down into the pit itself, dressed in fine traveling clothes far too clean and well-tailored for the dust and grime of Aldenmoor's ancient keep. As he reached the bottom and turned to face her, Elira realized with a start that she was looking upon King Edwin Marsh himself, come to see the impossible trial with his own eyes. The wolves stirred at his approach, Ash rising protectively to place himself between the king and Elira, a low warning rumbling deep within his chest. King Edwin, to his credit, did not flinch or reach for the sword at his hip, though his guards above shifted nervously at the sight of the great wolf's bared teeth. "Peace," Elira said quickly, placing a gentle hand on Ash's shoulder. "He means no harm." Slowly, reluctantly, the wolf's posture eased, though his amber eyes remained fixed on the newcomer with unmistakable wariness. King Edwin studied the scene before him with an expression of genuine astonishment, clearly having expected something entirely different from the tales that had reached his ears. "I confess," he said finally, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man accustomed to careful diplomacy. "I did not believe the reports when they first reached my court. A girl surviving the wolf den unharmed for 5 full days seemed the stuff of exaggerated legend rather than truth." "And now that you have seen it yourself, Your Majesty," Elira asked, keeping her voice steady, despite the trembling uncertainty in her chest, "what do you believe?" The king studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving between her calm expression and the protective stance of the wolf beside her. "I believe," he said slowly, "that there is a story here, far more interesting than witchcraft, and I intend to hear every part of it before I make my judgment." He gestured for his guards to remain above, choosing instead to seat himself carefully upon a flat stone near the pit's edge, close enough to speak comfortably, but respectful of the distance the wolves still seemed to require. Elira found herself surprised by this small gesture of consideration, so different from the harsh judgment she had faced only days before. "Tell me everything," King Edwin said, "from the beginning. Spare no detail." And so, with the wolves settling quietly around her once more, Elira began to speak, recounting the accusations brought against her by Lord Gareth Colton, the failed harvest and sick livestock that had nothing to do with her own quiet life gathering herbs at the forest's edge. She spoke of Agnes, the healer who had raised her in kindness after her mother's passing, and the strange bone token that even now remained hidden within the folds of her sleeve. King Edwin listened with careful attention, occasionally asking a pointed question that revealed a sharper mind than his youthful appearance might suggest. When Elira finished, the king remained silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the great gray wolf, still resting protectively at her side. "This bone token," he said finally, "may I see it?" Elira hesitated only briefly, before withdrawing the carved piece from her sleeve and passing it carefully into the king's outstretched palm. He turned it over slowly, studying the worn markings etched into its surface, his expression thoughtful. "My father once told me stories of old debts between men and beasts," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Kindness remembered across generations, passed down not through words but through blood and instinct. I confess I always believed such tales to be nothing more than comforting fiction." "Perhaps," Elira offered gently, "some fictions carry more truth than we are willing to admit." The king allowed himself the smallest smile at this, handing the token back to her with careful reverence. "Whatever the reason," he said, It is clear to me that these creatures show no intention of harming you, and I find myself increasingly doubtful of the accusations that brought you here in the first place. Tell me about this Lord Gareth Colton. What manner of man is he?" Elira chose her words carefully, wary of accusing a nobleman without proper evidence, yet unable to ignore the questions that had lingered in her own mind since the day of her sentencing. "He is a man whose fields failed, and whose cattle sickened," she said. "Whether by misfortune or by his own hand, I cannot say with certainty. I only know that I gave him no cause to fear me, and yet fear was exactly what drove his accusations." King Edwin nodded slowly, rising from the stone with the measured grace of a man already forming a plan within his mind. "I intend to investigate this matter further before I return to the capital," he said. "In the meantime, you shall remain here, though I will ensure your treatment improves considerably. No prisoner under my protection shall suffer needlessly while awaiting judgment." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Elira said, bowing her head with genuine gratitude, though a small part of her remained cautious, unwilling to trust fully in a kindness that could still be withdrawn as easily as it had been given. As the king climbed back up the rope ladder and disappeared once more into the world above, Elira settled back among her wolves, Ash resting his great head against her knee once more, Ren curling close against her side. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this nightmare might yet end in something other than tragedy. But high above the pit, within the private chambers of the keep, Lord Gareth Colton paced anxiously before a narrow window, watching the king's guards move through the courtyard with growing dread. He had not anticipated royal interest in what should have been a quiet, forgotten matter of village justice. Now, with King Edwin himself asking pointed questions about failed harvests and sickened cattle, Gareth understood with sudden, cold clarity that the true danger to his secrets had only just begun. Lady Corinne Ashby arrived in Aldenmore 2 days after the king himself, accompanied by a small contingent of royal guards and a quiet, observant scribe named Peter Langley, whose task it was to record every detail of the investigation with unwavering accuracy. She wasted no time on pleasantries, moving swiftly through the village with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the delicate politics of noble houses and their carefully hidden secrets. Her first stop was Lord Gareth Colton's estate, a modest but well-kept manor, situated at the edge of the failed farmland that had supposedly withered beneath Elira's imagined curse. Gareth greeted her with practiced hospitality, offering wine and fresh bread, his smile never quite reaching the wary tension visible in his eyes. "I am honored by the crown's attention to my troubles," he said, guiding Lady Corinne through his modest hall, "though I confess I am surprised the king himself would take such interest in a simple matter of village justice." "The king takes interest in many things," Lady Corinne replied evenly, her eyes drifting toward the neat rows of ledgers stacked upon a nearby writing desk, particularly when an old law results in an outcome no living soul has ever witnessed before. "Tell me, Lord Colton, when precisely did your cattle first begin to sicken?" Gareth hesitated only a moment before answering, though that brief pause did not escape Lady Corinne's practiced attention. "Nearly 2 months past," he said, "shortly after the girl was seen near my eastern pasture, gathering her herbs. And your crops? When did they begin to fail?" "Around the same time," he answered, though his voice carried a slight edge of impatience now. "Is there some particular reason for these questions, my lady?" Lady Corinne offered a thin, polite smile that revealed nothing of her true thoughts. "Simply thoroughness, Lord Colton. The king wishes every detail properly recorded before any judgment is finalized." She requested access to his stores and his fields, a request he could not easily refuse without arousing further suspicion. As Peter Langley carefully documented every observation, Lady Corinne moved methodically through the estate, examining the withered stalks of wheat still standing in the eastern field, noting the strange, uniform pattern of decay that seemed to spread outward from a single point, rather than drifting naturally with wind or disease. In the barn where the surviving cattle were kept, she found similar irregularities. The animals showed clear signs of illness, yet the symptoms did not match any natural affliction she had encountered in her years overseeing the kingdom's agricultural disputes. She noted a faint, bitter smell lingering near the feed troughs, subtle enough to escape casual notice, but unmistakable to someone trained to look for exactly such details. "Peter," she said quietly, once they were alone outside the barn, Send word to the royal physician in the capital. I want a sample of that feed examined immediately." The scribe nodded and hurried to complete the task, while Lady Corinne turned her attention toward the village records kept in the small administrative building near the square. There, she discovered something far more revealing than withered crops or sickened cattle. Buried among routine tax documents and property assessments, she found a series of debt records connecting Lord Gareth Colton directly to the royal treasury. Obligations accumulated over several years through poor harvests, failed investments, and increasingly desperate borrowing. The most recent entry, dated only weeks before Alira's arrest, showed a substantial payment deadline that Gareth had clearly been unable to meet. Beneath the official language of taxation and debt, Lady Corinne recognized the unmistakable shape of a man cornered by his own failures, searching desperately for any explanation that might shift blame away from himself, before the crown demanded payment he simply did not possess. She returned to the capital briefly to consult with the royal physician, whose examination of the feed sample confirmed her growing suspicions. Traces of a bitter, toxic root common to the region were found mixed within the cattle's feed, a substance that, when administered in small but consistent doses, would produce exactly the symptoms of slow, mysterious illness that Gareth had witnessed and reported. Someone poisoned his own herd, the physician confirmed, examining the sample under careful lamplight. Deliberately, and over an extended period. This was no accident of nature. Armed with this evidence, Lady Corinne returned to Aldenmore and requested a private audience with King Edwin, who had remained in the village throughout the investigation, splitting his time between overseeing the ongoing situation with Alira and managing the various administrative matters that inevitably followed a ruling monarch wherever he traveled. "The crops failed from a blight common enough in poorly maintained soil," she explained, laying out her findings before the king, in the quiet privacy of his temporary chambers within the keep. "Nothing supernatural, simply neglect and poor rotation of the eastern field. But the cattle were poisoned, Your Majesty, deliberately and repeatedly, using a toxic root known to grow wild throughout this region." King Edwin's expression darkened as he listened, his earlier suspicions now confirmed by cold, undeniable evidence. "And the debt records?" "Substantial," Lady Corinne confirmed. "Lord Colton owes the crown a considerable sum, with a payment deadline he had clearly been unable to meet. I believe, Your Majesty, that he poisoned his own herd deliberately, then used the resulting panic to construct an accusation against an innocent girl, hoping the chaos would distract from his mounting debts, and perhaps even earn him sympathy or forgiveness from a frightened, superstitious council, eager to believe in convenient explanations." The king was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. He had suspected corruption, certainly, but the deliberate cruelty of sacrificing an innocent life merely to escape financial obligation struck him as a betrayal far beyond simple greed. "Bring him before me," King Edwin said finally, his voice low and controlled despite the fury simmering beneath his measured tone. "I wish to hear his explanation directly, though I suspect no explanation will prove sufficient." Lord Gareth Colton was summoned to the keep that same evening, arriving with the confident bearing of a nobleman accustomed to navigating difficult conversations through careful words and practiced charm. That confidence faltered the moment he entered the chamber and saw the grim expressions worn by both the king and Lady Corinne, along with the neatly organized evidence spread across the table between them. "Your Majesty," Gareth began, offering a deep, formal bow, "I trust the investigation has proven satisfactory." "Sit down, Lord Colton," King Edwin said, his voice carrying none of its usual diplomatic warmth. Gareth's smile faltered as he lowered himself into the chair across from the king, his eyes flickering nervously toward the documents he could not yet fully read from his position. "We have found traces of poison in your cattle's feed," the king said plainly, watching closely for any reaction that might betray guilt or innocence. "A toxic root, administered deliberately over an extended period. We have also found substantial debt records connecting you to obligations you clearly struggled to meet." Gareth's face paled, though he attempted, with visibly failing composure, to maintain his earlier confidence. "Your Majesty, I assure you, I have no knowledge of any poison. My cattle simply sickened, as I reported honestly to the village council." "And the debts," Lady Corinne interjected coolly. "Do you deny those as well?" A long, heavy silence followed, broken only by the soft crackling of a nearby torch. Gareth's shoulders slowly sagged, the last remnants of his practiced confidence finally crumbling beneath the weight of evidence he could no longer credibly dispute. "I never intended for the girl to suffer," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I only needed time, Your Majesty. Time to recover from my losses before the crown demanded payment I could not provide." The accusation seemed a small thing, a temporary distraction that would fade once the harvest season improved. "A small thing," King Edwin repeated, his voice cold with quiet fury. "You condemned an innocent girl to a fate no prisoner has ever survived, simply to buy yourself a few additional months before facing the consequences of your own mismanagement." Gareth had no answer that could soften the truth now laid bare before them. He sat in silence, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by the hollow resignation of a man who understood, at last, that his carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed beyond any hope of repair. "You will remain here under guard," King Edwin instructed, rising from his seat with the measured control of a man determined not to let his anger dictate hasty judgment. "Tomorrow, before the full village, the truth of this matter will be revealed, and justice will be rendered accordingly, for both the girl you wrongfully condemned and the debts you sought so desperately to escape." As the guards led Lord Gareth Colton away to a modest holding chamber within the keep, King Edwin remained standing near the window, gazing out toward the pit where Alira still waited among her unlikely companions, unaware that the truth behind her suffering had finally, fully come to light. "Send word to the village council," he instructed Lady Corinne quietly. "Tomorrow morning, gather every soul willing to attend. It is time this entire kingdom understood exactly what transpired here, and exactly whose hands truly carried the guilt this village so eagerly assigned to an innocent girl." The following morning arrived with an unusual stillness settling over Aldenmore, as villagers gathered once more in the courtyard, drawn by whispered rumors that the king himself intended to speak publicly regarding the fate of the girl thrown to the wolves nearly a week before. Alira remained below in the pit, unaware of the events unfolding above her, though she sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, and anticipation carried faintly on the morning air. King Edwin stood upon the same raised platform where Alira's original sentencing had been delivered, though this time his presence commanded a silence far different from the fearful anticipation of before. Beside him stood Lady Corinne, along with the scribe Peter Langley, holding neatly organized documents that would soon reveal the truth long hidden beneath layers of fear and convenient assumption. Lord Gareth Colton stood nearby as well, flanked by 2 royal guards, his earlier confidence entirely absent, replaced instead by the pale, hollow expression of a man awaiting judgment he could no longer avoid. "Villagers of Aldenmore," King Edwin began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Nearly a week ago, this village condemned an innocent girl to a fate designed by ancient law to determine guilt through the judgment of creatures beyond human deception. That judgment has been rendered, clearly and unmistakably, through the mercy those creatures have shown her every single day since her descent into that pit." A murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertain whispers exchanged between neighbors who had, until this moment, remained divided in their beliefs regarding Alira's true nature. "But mercy from wolves is not the only truth uncovered these past days," the king continued, his tone hardening as he turned his attention toward Lord Gareth. "A thorough investigation has revealed that the very accusations brought against this girl were built upon deliberate deception, orchestrated by a man desperate to escape debts of his own making." Gasps spread through the courtyard as Lady Corinne stepped forward, presenting the evidence gathered over the preceding days with clear, methodical precision. She spoke of the poisoned feed discovered within Gareth's barn, the debt records connecting him directly to obligations he could not meet, the deliberate timing of his accusations against Alira only weeks before his payment deadline to the crown. Edmund Voss, standing near the platform's edge, visibly paled as the full weight of the council's hasty judgment became clear before the entire village. He had presided over Alira's condemnation without demanding proper evidence, eager to satisfy a frightened populace rather than pursue genuine justice, and now that failure stood exposed before his king and his people alike. "I acted only out of desperation," Gareth finally said, his voice breaking through the stunned silence that had settled over the crowd. "I never intended lasting harm. I believed, foolishly, that the matter would resolve itself before anyone discovered the truth." "Desperation does not excuse cruelty," King Edwin replied firmly. "You condemned an innocent girl to what you believed would be certain death, simply to protect yourself from consequences entirely of your own making. That is not desperation, Lord Colton. That is cowardice, dressed in the language of necessity. The crowd, once so eager to condemn Illyra based on nothing more than fear and rumor, now stood in uncomfortable silence, many faces flushed with shame as they recalled their own eager participation in her earlier humiliation. The young boy Illyra had once treated for fever stood near the front once more, his mother beside him, both watching, with expressions that mixed relief with lingering guilt. "Bring the girl before us," King Edwin commanded. A guard hurried toward the pit, lowering the rope ladder once more, calling down that Illyra was to be brought up before the entire village. She rose slowly, her hand resting one final time on Ash's broad head, feeling a strange reluctance to leave the strange sanctuary that had, against every expectation, kept her safe through the darkest days of her life. "I must go," she whispered to the great wolf, who watched her with steady amber eyes, as though somehow understanding the significance of the moment. Wren pressed close against her leg, and the two younger pups peered out from behind their boulder, watching with the same quiet curiosity they had shown since her arrival. Illyra climbed the ladder slowly, her legs stiff from days spent on the cold, packed earth of the den, emerging finally into bright morning sunlight that felt almost foreign against her skin after so long in shadow. The crowd that had once jeered and thrown rotten vegetables now stood in near total silence, watching her emerge with expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet shame. She walked toward the platform where King Edwin waited, her steps steady despite the weakness in her legs, her eyes finding Agnes near the edge of the crowd, the old healer's face streaked with tears of relief she made no effort to hide. Illyra offered her the smallest grateful smile, before turning her full attention toward the king. "Illyra of Aldenmore," King Edwin said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "This village condemned you based on fear and false accusation. The wolves you were meant to fall victim to instead showed you mercy, beyond what any of us could have anticipated, and a thorough investigation has revealed the truth behind the charges brought against you. By the authority granted to me as king of this land, I hereby declare you fully innocent of all accusations, and I extend to you the sincere apology of this crown for the suffering you endured through no fault of your own." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, though this time carrying relief rather than fear. Illyra felt tears finally sting her own eyes, the accumulated weight of fear and uncertainty from the past week beginning, at last, to lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she managed, her voice trembling with emotion she no longer needed to suppress. King Edwin turned next toward Lord Gareth Colton, his expression hardening once more as he addressed the disgraced nobleman. "For your crimes of deliberate deception, false accusation, and the poisoning of your own livestock to escape rightful debt, you are hereby stripped of your title and lands. Your remaining assets shall be seized to satisfy your obligations to the crown, and you shall spend the coming years laboring to repay what remains of your debt through honest work, a fate far kinder than the one you so callously arranged for an innocent girl." Gareth lowered his head, offering no further protest, understanding well enough that any remaining argument would only worsen the judgment already rendered against him. The guards led him away from the platform, his once proud bearing now replaced by the quiet defeat of a man whose deception had finally, fully unraveled before the very people he had once ruled over, with careless authority. King Edwin then turned his attention back toward Illyra, his expression softening slightly. "I understand you endured considerable hardship these past days," he said. "Is there anything the crown might offer in recompense for the injustice you suffered?" Illyra considered this question carefully, her thoughts drifting back toward the pit below, toward Ash and Wren, and the two young pups who had shown her kindness when the entire village had shown her only fear. "There is one thing, Your Majesty," she said finally. "The wolves who share that den beneath the keep have lived their entire lives as instruments of fear and punishment, forced to bear the weight of humanity's cruelty toward one another. I ask that they be protected henceforth, that no further prisoners be thrown into that pit, and that the wolves themselves be allowed to live free from the burden of serving as executioners for crimes they had no part in creating." A murmur of surprise spread through the crowd at this unexpected request, though King Edwin's expression revealed something closer to admiration than confusion. "A remarkable request," he said, "though perhaps not entirely surprising, given the mercy you yourself received from these very creatures. Very well. I hereby decree that the wolf den beneath Aldenmore's keep shall never again be used as a means of trial or punishment. The wolves currently residing there shall be granted safe passage back into the surrounding forest, protected from hunters and harm by royal decree, and any further disputes within this village shall be settled through proper evidence and honest testimony, rather than ancient superstition dressed in the language of justice. The crowd erupted into a mixture of applause and stunned murmurs, the weight of an entire tradition suddenly overturned by the simple mercy of a girl who had every reason to demand vengeance instead. Agnes pushed her way through the gathered villagers, finally reaching Elira's side, pulling her into a tight, relieved embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed. "You survived," Agnes whispered against her hair. "I never doubted it, not for a single moment." "I could not have survived without your gift," Elira replied, still clutching the bone token tightly within her palm. "Whatever mercy those wolves carried within them, you gave me the key to unlock it." The following days brought considerable change to the quiet village of Aldenmore. Guards descended once more into the pit, this time not to deliver punishment, but to guide Ash, Ren, and the two young pups safely back toward the surrounding forest where they belonged. Elira insisted on accompanying them for this final journey, walking alongside the wolves as they emerged from the keep's shadow into the open air and sunlight they had likely not experienced in years. At the forest's edge, Ash paused, turning back toward Elira one final time, his amber eyes meeting hers with an expression that felt, impossibly, like gratitude. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead gently against his, in a final gesture of farewell, before he finally turned and led his small pack back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing from view within moments. "Will you miss them?" Agnes asked, watching from a respectful distance as Elira rose and brushed the dirt from her knees. "More than I expected to," Elira admitted. "Strange, is it not, that the creatures meant to end my life instead became the only true comfort I found during the darkest days of my existence." Agnes smiled softly, wrapping an arm around Elira's shoulders as they began the walk back toward the village. "Perhaps that is simply the nature of true mercy," she said. "It rarely arrives from the places we expect, and it often teaches us far more than we anticipated learning." News of the trial's true outcome spread quickly throughout the surrounding countryside, carried by merchants and travelers who had witnessed the king's judgment firsthand. Within weeks, the story reached every corner of the kingdom, told and retold in taverns and marketplaces, each version adding new details while preserving the essential truth at its core. A girl condemned by fear, saved by mercy, and vindicated by justice, that finally triumphed over corruption and cowardice. King Edwin, before departing Aldenmore to return to his capital, offered Elira a position within the royal court as an advisor on matters of natural medicine and rural justice, recognizing both her skill as a healer and her unusual understanding of the delicate balance between fear and truth that had so nearly cost her life. Elira accepted, though she insisted on returning periodically to Aldenmore to continue her work alongside Agnes, unwilling to abandon the healing practice that had defined her life long before wolves and kings had ever entered her story. Lord Gareth Colton spent the following years laboring under strict royal supervision to repay his considerable debts, his once proud name becoming a quiet cautionary tale whispered among nobles throughout the kingdom, a warning against the dangers of desperation left unchecked by honesty or restraint. Edmund Voss, humbled by his role in Elira's wrongful condemnation, dedicated himself afterward to reforming the village council's approach to justice, insisting on proper evidence and careful deliberation, rather than the fearful assumptions that had so nearly cost an innocent life. As for the wolf den beneath Aldenmore's ancient keep, it remained empty from that day forward, its heavy iron door left permanently unlocked, its dark depths gradually reclaimed by nature, as vines and moss crept slowly across stones once stained by fear and cruelty. Villagers who passed near the old keep in later years often spoke of the strange, peaceful quiet that seemed to settle over the ruins, as though the very stones themselves remembered the mercy that had finally broken centuries of unnecessary suffering. Years later, travelers passing through the forest surrounding Aldenmore would sometimes report glimpses of wolves moving gracefully between the trees, watching quietly from a respectful distance, rather than approaching with aggression or fear. Hunters within the kingdom's borders learned quickly to avoid these particular woods, protected as they were by royal decree, and over time, The wolves of Aldenmore became something of a local legend themselves, protectors of the forest, rather than creatures to be feared. Alira visited the forest often during her periodic returns to the village, though she rarely encountered her old companions directly, understanding well enough that wild creatures belong to the wild, regardless of whatever strange bond had once formed between them. On one particular visit, several years after the trial that had changed her life so dramatically, she caught sight of a familiar shape moving between distant trees, a great gray wolf with a scarred muzzle, watching her for a long, quiet moment, before disappearing once more into the shadows of the forest he now called home. She never spoke of that final glimpse to anyone, holding it instead as a private, precious memory, proof that the mercy shown to her in that dark pit so many years before had never truly faded, simply transformed into something quieter, something carried forward through the passing seasons, like the gentle, persistent memory of kindness that Agnes had always insisted the wolves carried within their very nature. The story of the girl thrown into the wolf den became, in time, a tale told throughout the entire kingdom, though the details shifted and softened with each retelling, as stories often do when passed from voice to voice across generations. Yet the essential truth at its heart remained unchanged, a lesson repeated in villages and courts alike, that fear makes poor judges, that cruelty disguised as tradition remains cruelty nonetheless, and that mercy, when given freely, has a remarkable way of returning to those who least expect it, in forms as unexpected and enduring as the quiet loyalty of wolves who chose compassion over the violence the world had expected of them. And so, in the quiet village of Aldenmore, where an ancient law had once demanded blood in the name of justice, a new understanding slowly took root instead, one built not on fear, but on the simple, enduring truth that kindness given honestly, even to the smallest and most vulnerable among us, has a way of echoing forward through time, reshaping not only individual lives, but the very foundations of the world that witnesses it.